This is the Ocean Ranger. When it was first launched, it was billed as the world's largest oil rig, which was quite astounding. It was like a giant floating stadium, designed to resist the harshest weather conditions in the North Atlantic Ocean. However, on February 14, 1981, something happened on board that made it the worst place on Earth for the crew to be stuck. This is the terrifying story of the Ocean Ranger, and as always, viewer discretion is suggested. By the 1960s, substantial research had begun off Canada's east coast, with exploratory oil drilling near Newfoundland and Labrador. After the commencement, the focus quickly shifted to the Grand Banks, an underwater plateau off the shore. This area was formerly one of the world's richest fishing grounds, and the province's economy was based on the fishing sector. Unfortunately, by the end of the 20th century, overfishing had resulted in the extinction of several species, forcing the province to turn elsewhere for survival. Fortunately, this area happened to be rich in oil. In 1979, geologists discovered oil at what became known as the Hibernia oilfield. This discovery was incredibly significant and could be the largest the country has ever seen. Striking oil is not the same as pumping it, and discovering it is merely the beginning. After then, the firms participating, led by Mobil Oil, needed to determine the size of the reserve. They needed data, and to get it, they needed to drill a succession of wells to map out the oil reserve's borders and capacity. This is when the Ocean Ranger steps in. This was a gigantic cutting-edge drilling rig that arrived in the area during the winter of 1982 and began punching a hole in the bottom. However, data began to stream back in, changing the province's economic future. At first glance, the Ocean Ranger appears to be something out of science fiction. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries built the platform in 1976, and it was a floating colossus. It was 396 feet, 121 meters, long, 262 feet, 80 meters broad, and 337 feet, 103 meters tall. The rig's total weight exceeded 25,000 tons. Odico, the firm that owned the Ocean Ranger, described it as the world's largest semi-submersible oil rig at the time. Interestingly, rather than standing on fixed legs anchored to the ocean floor, the Ocean Ranger floated. Its deck, where the drilling took place, was elevated above the water, supported by 8 huge columns that ascended from 2 underwater pontoons. These pontoons contained ballast tanks, which allowed salt water to be pumped in or out to alter the platform's position. The entire system then operated via a network of valves and pumps that were controlled from a specialist chamber deep within the rig. And this system is ingenious. By sinking the pontoons beneath the surface, the rig could avoid the worst of the ocean's movement. And unlike surface ships that rock in heavy waves, the Ocean Ranger sat largely steady, regardless of the weather. This design also had another advantage. It made the rig movable. The Ocean Ranger could be hauled into place and stabilized with 12 huge anchors, each weighing 45,000 pounds. Once fixed in place, it could function in water depths of up to 1,500 feet, 460 meters, and drill down to more than 25,000 feet, 7,600 meters. Furthermore, the rig was designed to withstand huge waves, hurricane-force winds, blinding snowstorms, and everything else the legendary North Atlantic threw at it. By the 1980s, the Ocean Ranger had worked in 2 seas and weathered more than 50 storms since its inception in 1976. By late November 1981, the Ocean Ranger had settled into its duties at the Hibernia oilfield. The well it was working on, J34, was its 3rd on the site, and, given that it was January, the Grand Banks were as frigid and harsh as ever. However, for the 84 guys who lived and worked on the rig, this was just another job. 2 semi-submersible rigs were also in operation nearby, Sedco 706 and Zapata Ugland. The 3 platforms worked together to drill exploratory wells in their different parts of the ocean. And, while they weren't within shouting distance, they were close enough to notice each other's presence and frequently traded radio traffic and weather information. J34's operations continued normally for several months until February 1982. It was there when forecasts announced on Sunday, February 14th, that a big winter storm was forming, linked to a huge Atlantic hurricane, and was expected to pass straight over the rigs later in the day. The morning forecast predicted winds of up to 90 knots and waves of more than 37 feet, or 11 meters. Obviously, these conditions were not ideal, but they were not uncommon either. The Ocean Ranger had faced worse before. By mid-afternoon, the crew had begun the process known as hanging off. This is a routine process for disconnecting and retracting the drill pipe to prevent it from snapping in severe seas. By approximately 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, the rig was effectively battened down and prepared to face the storm. What no one recognized at the time was that this was going to be more than just another hard night at sea. Around 7 p.m., a rogue wave struck the Sedco 706 rig. This abnormally huge surge was powerful enough to damage pieces of its deck and tear away a life raft. This should have been a red flag, but on the Ocean Ranger just miles away, everything seemed under control. Around 8 p.m., however, another large wave crashed the Ocean Ranger, smashing a window known as a port light in the ballast control room. In an instant, that one point of vulnerability, located 28 feet, 8.5 meters from the waterline, had transformed into a direct doorway for the storm. Seawater then surged into the control room, drenching the console that controlled the rig's ballast system. With that single strike, the Ocean Ranger's most crucial internal system was jeopardized. The ballast control room was essentially the brain that kept the entire rig balanced. From that room, a single operator on a 12-hour shift could open and stop valves, transfer ballast water between compartments, and fine-tune the platform's location to keep it stable even in turbulent waters. It did, however, have one fatal flaw. It was not designed to get wet. After the wave slammed through the port light and wet the ballast control console, the crew was unsure of the extent of the damage, but they acted quickly. The power to the control system was then either cut off by the water itself or deliberately turned off to avoid electrical shock. Soon after, a cleanup team entered the room to investigate the situation and discovered something unusual. The lights on the ballast control panel were blinking red and green. That meant the valves opened and closed on their own. If the lights were correct, the ballast tanks on the port side were filling with seawater, causing the rig to lean in that direction, which was very perilous given the weather. The crew had to react immediately. There was a kill switch that could turn off all power to the system and automatically close the valves, but it was not located in the control room. They would have to call the rig's electrician to locate it. It was about an hour later, shortly after 9 p.m., when the switch was eventually thrown. The Ocean Ranger then radioed the other neighboring rigs to report that a port light had been smashed and the control room was flooded. But, almost as if relieved, the transmission was quiet and the crew reported that the crisis had been resolved. For the following few hours, everything appeared to be stable. The Ocean Ranger maintained normal radio connections with its neighbors and support vessels in the region. Weather reports still reported terrible winds and towering waves, some as high as 65 feet, 20 meters, but there were no signals of panic on board. From the outside, the rig appeared to have taken the hit and shrugged it off. By all appearances, turning off electricity to the ballast control system had resolved the matter, and with the valves shut and the storm raging outside, the Ocean Ranger appeared to be riding it out. But around midnight, the crew took a decision that sealed the rig's doom. For whatever reason, they turned on the electricity again. Why they did this is still unclear. They may have wished to lift the rig slightly to stay higher above the waves, or they may have simply checked to see if the system was functional after drying off the panel. Whatever the reason, restoring power brought the crippled machine to life, and it no longer performed predictably. Some of the valves in the front ballast tanks started opening again. However, whether these were caused by short circuits or operator input, the outcome remained the same. Seawater rushed into the rig's bow, causing the Ocean Ranger to lean forward gradually. Around this time, surrounding rigs and vessels picked up radio chatter from the Ocean Ranger, including reports of the rig listing and numerous attempts to turn off the ballast system again. But the harm had already been done. Each time the crew attempted to turn off the power and stop the water flow, the few seconds it took for the valves to close allowed even more water to enter the ballast tanks. Normally, the solution to remedy a forward list is to push the water back out through the pumps at the back of the rig. However, the angle of the rig rendered this impossible. The pump just did not have the power to move the water that far upward. There was another option. Move water from the bow to the middle tanks, but no one on board appears to have known how to do so. So, in desperation, someone in the control room devised a backup plan. There was a set of brass rods that could be used to manually manipulate the valves if the system failed. The crew then turned off the power again and started threading the rods into the panel, but they quickly detected a problem. The rods could only open and not close the valves. Without electricity, the control room's indicators were inoperable, so the crew had no idea which valves were open, which were closed, or where the water was flowing. This meant they were working blind, and with each move, the situation worsened. As more valves were opened, more water entered the forward tanks. The rig's listing gradually became steeper, and it soon reached a point from which it could not recover. All the while, the churning sea below was only 5 degrees Celsius, 41 Fahrenheit. Any splashing inside would have been quite cold. As the bow dipped lower, the tops of the rig's corner columns, which are ordinarily safely more than 80 feet, 24 meters above sea level, were suddenly within reach of the storm surges. This is where another design fault became apparent. At the top of each of these corner columns, there were huge, uncovered holes that served as access points for the massive chains and cables that helped anchor the rig. These storage spaces were not covered by hatches or lids, and while this would not be an issue under normal circumstances, the Ocean Ranger was no longer sitting level. So, one by one, the waves crashed into the open chain lockers, filling them with seawater, and because there were no alarms or sensors in place to alert the crew, they had no idea what was happening. As far as they knew, the rig was still responding to whatever was going on inside the ballast tanks. So, oblivious of the flooding in the lockers, the ballast control team attempted to solve the problem by inserting extra brass rods into the console. With no functional signs, workers were mistakenly opening more valves and letting more water to flow in. Eventually, the issue became undeniable. At roughly 1 a.m., the Ocean Ranger began sending Mayday signals. The crew realized they were in serious peril. The Seaforth Highlander, the rig's backup vessel, received a call and raced in as fast as it could, but the weather was relentless, with winds exceeding 115 miles per hour, waves taller than houses, and visibility approaching zero. Even getting close to the rig would take more than an hour, and that was an optimistic estimate. Half an hour later, at 1:30 a.m., the Ocean Ranger issued its final radio signal, informing the crew that they were moving to the lifeboat stations to abandon the rig. By the time the Ocean Ranger's final message was broadcast over the radio, the situation had already beyond the point of no return. The rig was listing considerably, between 10 and 15 degrees, and the sea was battering it from all sides. The crew immediately began lowering the lifeboats, but even this was a gamble. They were dealing with what was effectively a tower in the middle of the ocean, and, in hurricane-force gusts, the lifeboats had to swing down from such enormous heights. As one might expect, some never made it. Violent winds drove them against the edge of the rig, smashing the lifeboat hulls before they could even reach the ocean. Others were even inverted or ripped apart before they could be boarded. Many of the guys are thought to have jumped or been thrown into the freezing Atlantic, though this is not completely known. Even strong swimmers could only last a few minutes in such chilly water before succumbing to hypothermia. That's not to mention the big, powerful swells they experienced. The Seaforth Highlander arrived at the spot just after 2 a.m. They shot an emergency flare to break through the pandemonium, but what they saw was bleak. The Ocean Ranger was still afloat, but it was seriously listing, with waves constantly pouring over the deck. There were no signs of life on board, and the lifeboats appeared to be all gone. Debris was also thrown across the ocean, but they discovered one wrecked lifeboat with survivors still alive inside. Nearby assistance vessels came shortly afterwards, but the conditions were harsh. Visibility was terrible, the sea was still storming, and the Ocean Ranger was quickly disappearing. By 2:45 a.m., the rig was barely above water, and by 3:10, it had totally vanished from radar. The entire crew of 84 men, which included 46 mobile employees and 38 contractors, died. Search and rescue attempts proceeded all night and into the following days, but were primarily met with silence. 2 more lifeboats were discovered empty. Several life rafts were also discovered, although they were severely damaged and lacked survivors. Only 22 bodies were ever retrieved. Autopsies eventually revealed that the males had drowned, largely from hypothermia. In the days and weeks following the Ocean Ranger's disappearance beneath the North Atlantic, investigators were left with a complex puzzle. How did the most modern semi-submersible rig of its day wind up at the bottom of the ocean? The solution, as it turned out, was not a single failure. The ending started with a broken porthole, and it only got messier from there. The control panel, saturated in ocean water, failed, causing panic among a staff anxiously attempting to figure out what was wrong with the rig's ballast system. To make matters worse, it appears that the crew had no idea how to fix it. The ballast control operators received little formal training, only a few weeks of shadowing more experienced operators. In lieu of classroom instruction and certification, students received on-the-job training under typical conditions. They didn't go through a single simulated emergency. In fact, one of the operators had only been on the job for 12 weeks before being assigned to oversee the brake stability. In addition, there were no established emergency protocols in case of a ballast system failure. The team went for the brass rods, but they had no idea how they operated, and their careless tweaks just made matters worse. The flooding chain lockers, like the porthole, were another design error that contributed to the accident. By the time the Mayday call was sent, the list was too long to overcome, and the water was too high. The rig's pumps were unable to transport water back to its intended destination. Rescue crews couldn't reach close enough in time, and lifeboats and rafts weren't ready for such intense conditions. Official assessments from the U.S. Coast Guard and the Canadian Royal Commission identified numerous reasons of the accident, including inadequate crew training, a lack of defined safety protocols, major defects in the rig's design, and insufficient regulation and control from government authorities. In summary, it appeared like the Ocean Ranger was a tragedy waiting to happen. In 1983, a Dutch salvage company lifted the Ocean Ranger and re-sunk it in deeper seas to remove the navigational hazard it caused to North Atlantic shipping channels. However, even that operation ended tragically. 3 divers were killed in 2 separate accidents during the retrieval operation. Finally, the Commission's findings prompted major reforms in offshore legislation. The crew training standards were updated, survival suits became necessary, lifeboat designs were reviewed, and safety drills were implemented. And crucial control systems would no longer be dependent on a single point of failure. To this day, the disaster is the deadliest offshore drilling accident in Canadian history. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Anyway, thank you again, and I hope to see you in the next one.